Probably to my detriment. I'm like always 2 or 3 years late on any YouTube trend, but it's time I got around to the 5 albums that changed my life for the better. All right, so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to start with an incredibly formative time in my life, the earliest years that I remember really fully appreciating and internalizing an album's length of music, which is really that kind of middle school or pre-middle school time, so maybe the ages of 9 to 12-ish. So I'm going to start there with 5 albums in this one, and then in parts 2, parts 3, I'll keep going chronologically through my life, maybe the high school years, maybe the 20s or the college life. One thing I want to say about this is, am I the first person to be influenced by some of these bands that I'm going to mention? Definitely not. Some of these are very mainstream big artists, and I was doing a lot of just following other people's recommendations at this time. Neighborhood Kids was mainly the influence, but as I grew up, my taste became more eclectic, and that's what I realized going through this exercise. So you'll see it range more and more as I get into high school and college and beyond. And another thing is I'm 30 years old, so I think my age and everyone's age has a lot to do with what music they like and what they consider good. The pull, if you will, that they're always kind of leaning towards in what they listen to, because if I'm 15 and I'm listening to an album and you're 35, your experience of that is so much different. If you're like a cynical 22-year-old and I was 12 when I heard an album, those experiences are going to be very different. And again, this will just cover that golden period of music discovery for me, the earliest times that I can remember really soaking in an album. And parts 2, parts 3, and onward will be linked down below once they're out. Okay, so number 1, picture this. We got little Matt. He's got some spiky hair, a lot like I do now. And then my neighborhood friend Jake comes along and introduces me to this live album, How the West Was Won by Zeppelin. And pretty much my whole musical worldview shifts from that day forward. But the studio album that did it, the one that really just shifted a lot of things for me, was Houses of the Holy. I remember the ocean was one of the first obsessions in my little group of like 11-year-olds. It's pretty rare, like a group of middle school kids gets off the bus and we're all just like, bow, 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 bow. The song remains the same, and the Rain song remain in my top 5 Zeppelin tunes. The completely shifting moods of these songs and the way they're able to quickly build and then resolve tension is spectacular. I mean, simply second to none. And at the time, I wasn't raised on a lot of progressive rock, so these were the most progressive song structures I'd ever heard at 5, 6, 7 minutes. I wasn't used to the 10, the 15, the 20-minute songs. But they're so economical in their progressiveness. The chord sequences in these songs, the pure muscle of each band member here. Where else do you get a band where the personality of each player is so evident in every moment of every song, yet it's more than the sum of its parts? They have a chemistry together. I think just the pure sonics of Zeppelin, the pure muscle of Zeppelin is unmatched in rock groups. And while I'd go on to discover the first 4 albums, and I think Physical Graffiti is probably my favorite, this was the first full-length album, and every single song is legendary. Number 2 on the list, I think I was about 11 when I first heard this album, and it's a greatest hits album, which I think is a great format at that age. You just want all killer, no filler, and it's also a great way for like millennials like me to discover dad rock albums of a bygone era. I remember sitting in my dad's white Oldsmobile going to a basketball tournament, and I confessed my love for Robert Plant, for Jimmy Page, and I think like the next day he went out and got me a bunch of classic rock CDs, of course. Dark Side of the Moon, of course, and the Beatles won that greatest hits album, and I think the Doors were in there, and Creedence Clearwater Revival, and the one that really spoke to me the most, especially as a fan of R&B and kind of hip hop at the time, and also just really good vocals. I was really into NSYNC as a kid, was Queen's greatest hits. And specifically the first one of their platinum collection. I think there are 2 albums, and it has like Bohemian Rhapsody and Play the Game, and Fat Bottom Girls. And let's see, Another One Bites the Dust, Bicycle Race, You're My Best Friend, Don't Stop Me Now, Save Me, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Somebody to Love, Good Old Fashioned Lover Boy. I loved that song as a kid. Flash, Seven Seas of Rye, another one I loved. We Will Rock You, We Are the Champions. I mean, just an 11-year-old's treasure trove right there. I don't really need to say too much about Zeppelin and Queen, but you can imagine that this music was a revelation at the time. I mean, I had heard nothing like it, and it just totally opened my mind. And I remember my dad seeing the Paul Rodgers with Queen concert in the paper. Downstairs, I remember exactly where I was, and he said, we should definitely go to this. That was my first concert. For some reason, the song I remember there was Dragon Attack. And I remember a Brian May solo where he like walked way out. It was great. I mentioned my friend Jake earlier, who turned me on to Zeppelin and so many other bands, mainly by just like throwing burned CDs at me in his room. And that goes for this next pick as well, which is moving us up to the modern period of that time. It's Wolfmother's self-titled album. Wolfmother is a power trio who took 70s classic rock and gave it this fresh, modern sheen. They were kind of like my Black Sabbath, you know, not nearly as dark, of course, but I hadn't really heard that kind of just like power chord riffage before. And I feel like they bridge the gap for me between a more stadium-worthy sound, a more pop sound, and this heavy riffage, you know, bum, bum, lots of that. I can't really imagine how many times we actually listened to that album. It was just countless. I think this is moving up a little bit in my life. I was maybe 12 at this point, like 2006. In retrospect, this is a pretty simple, a pretty formulaic hard rock album, but you know, it really hit hard. There's a lot of pentatonic scales. There's a lot of just 1 to 2 interval riffs. But it was a new slice of psychedelic music that I hadn't really experienced before, mixed with the hard rock from Zeppelin, the pop, like I said, from Queen, all that rolled into a ball. It felt like my band too, you know, unlike these 70s bands that I was rediscovering. And I still really jam to this thing, you know, that high-pitched scream to start the album on Dimension, and just Andrew Stockdale's ridiculous high range in general. He's got the look too, you know, he's got the hair, he's got the Gibson SG. The hammer-on riff in Joker and the Thief, I mean, that is just made for a lot of people. And my band at the time definitely played that for our 7th grade class. The songs Tales and Vagabond are probably my 2 other favorites. And just to keep the middle school nostalgia flowing, we've got an album that a lot of people trash, and I think it's mainly like 90s kids who remember a more powerful, raw, and angsty version of this band. But for me, coming to age in the early 2000s, the first exposure I had to anything resembling modern prog or rock opera came in the form of Green Day's American Idiot. I so remember just the tingling feeling of listening to Jesus of Suburbia or Homecoming for the first time, those 9-minute songs, which were probably the longest songs I had ever heard in my life at that point. The way they twisted and turned and seamlessly transitioned from section to section in a very progressive way, without sacrificing one bit of pop appeal. You know, there are hooks at every turn. Looking back, I think that album really did something to me, because I do appreciate kind of 5 to 10 minute song lengths a lot, and things that do adventure and take you on a journey. You know, that kind of cliche, but don't plod on endlessly. I think the melodies are just fantastic on this album. I remember singing it in the shower. The themes and the style are a little bit juvenile in retrospect, but I can see how this album really did shift me as a listener and just change the way that I hear things. The melodies have to hit, you know, they have to be just as good in the verses as they are on the chorus. And that's kind of a rule of my listening still, and this album definitely does that. Next up is another later career album from a band that, like Green Day, had probably, before this album, hit their peak. Like, if you look at their career in totality, you'd probably pick out something earlier than this as the most critical success, but also just, you know, the band's creative peak. And that is Stadium Arcadium by the Chili Peppers. And this one I think is mostly about timing. I think at the time it came out, I was in 7th grade. I was playing bass in a band and really starting to get into music. And I was just hungry for really catchy pop rock songs with great bass playing. Flea and Geddy Lee and John Paul Jones were my biggest influences at the time. I also just loved the whole Frusciante era of this band. His playing wasn't overly complex, it wasn't overly meticulous, but just the passion, the joy, and the camaraderie of the band at this time just oozes out of this double album. And you can tell they loved it so much at the time that they just couldn't stop writing. And I think this double album works in every way. I'm so glad they didn't cut it down to one, because I really can't choose a favorite between Jupiter and Mars. I think they're both amazing, and really at the time especially, I was obsessed with every single song. Maybe besides Danny California, because it was played so much on the radio at the time, but songs like the title track, Death of a Martian, Animal Bar, Charlie, Hey, the list just goes on. Wet Sand? These songs remain very close to my heart and just an inspiration in every way. I stand by this album. I don't see many cracks in the thing. I think it's all so well written, it's so catchy, but it's so, involved at the same time. There's so many good instrumental lines and choices, and just the chemistry between band members. Yeah, it's great. And that's the first 5 albums, I guess, that changed my life for the better. I feel like that should be in parentheses. Let me know what you think of these albums, but also don't, because I don't care. But I do care about the albums that shaped your musical worldview, if you will, and the albums that changed your life. So do let me know down below. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
And my home is in